Greetings and welcome to Envisioning Institutional Responses to Supporting Scholar Safety. My name is Keenan Colquitt. I'm the Program Manager for Diversity Scholar Engagement with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, at the University of Michigan. We're proud to sponsor this event in collaboration with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, University of Michigan's Office of Vice President for Research, and the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education, or NADAHE. We begin this presentation with land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Three Fires Confederacy made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. And now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Trishette Johnson. Dr. Johnson is Associate Vice President for Research, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives at the University of Michigan's Office of the Vice President for Research. She is also University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor and Professor of Mathematics. Thank you for offering your remarks today. I am looking forward to hearing your comments.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Keenan, for the introduction. OVPR's mission is to catalyze, support, and safeguard research and scholarship across the University of Michigan. We take pride in our efforts, and we see them as an important part of helping the university realize its mission, which is to serve the people of Michigan and the world through preeminence in creating, communicating, preserving, and applying knowledge, art, and academic values, and in developing leaders and citizens who will challenge the present and enrich the future. We are proud of our academic standing and reputation, and we have developed a variety of services to support researchers and to amplify the impact of their scholarship. We have also invested in new areas for knowledge discovery and creative practice. For example, for the past 3 years, OVPR has offered anti-racism grants. These grants catalyze innovative research and scholarship efforts that advance knowledge and understanding around complex societal issues and inform actions to achieve racial equity and justice. During the first 3 cycles of the anti-racism grant program, OVPR awarded nearly $1.5 million in total funding to support 23 interdisciplinary teams studying really important topics that span the spectrum, from biosocial effects of structural racism on birth outcomes to the intersection of redlining and chronic disease in Detroit. We are proud of these efforts, but we understand that institutional funding alone just is not enough. Part of doing this important work is recognizing the inequities that exist in access to funding for different disciplines and fields. It is also critical that scholars have a relative level of safety to pursue their research towards making important knowledge contributions to their respective fields and to society. For the past several years, we have witnessed an increase in the targeting of scholars whose research and scholarship focused on marginalized identities and communities. Examples include scholars receiving hate mail at their home addresses, doxing or sharing personal contact information publicly as a form of harassment. And some scholars have even been physically stalked, assaulted, or manipulated into elaborate schemes to discredit and shame them based on their scholarly expertise. Let's be clear. When this happens, when scholars are targeted, it causes harm. This harm can discourage scholars from pursuing critical research and scholarship that serve our institutional mission, and it also poses a serious threat to our academic freedom. So now is the time that we must ask ourselves, what is the role of the institution when our scholars are harassed and threatened with harm on the basis of their research agendas and the identities they hold? As a part of DEI 2.0, OVPR will be doubling down on our commitment to identify advocate for, and invest in faculty-driven exploration in areas of discovery that impact DEI and impact justice. We are also committed to cultivating an environment where a multitude of perspectives, identities, skills, and talents unite to ignite transformation, thereby empowering research to genuinely benefit the global community without fear of retaliation or harm. That's why I'm looking forward to the important discussion we're about to have today. It's going to be a sharing of ideas, approaches, and examples that will help us shape our thinking around institutional strategies to support scholar safety. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. I'm pleased to turn things over to Liz Cole, who is the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity and University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, Psychology, and Afro-American and African Studies here at the University of Michigan. She also co-chairs our university's Inclusive History Project. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Trishette. NCID organized this panel as part of our theme this year, which is Doing DEI Now. It's a series looking at how we can continue to work effectively for inclusive climates and to conduct scholarship and teaching about diversity within the current political and social context. As part of this series, last month we held a webinar about the interdependence of DEI and free speech, and you can view that on our website, and we'll put the link in the chat for you. Please, this talk will go up on the website eventually if you'd like to share it with colleagues, and please watch for future events in this series that will hold in winter term. In 2017, the AAUP put out a call asking faculty who'd been targeted as a result of something they said in their classroom or publications or their outside work to respond to a survey. And this was in 2017. They got 50 responses, and the respondents shared many harrowing stories. So just to share one example, someone described a student taking a course that included content related to fracking and climate change, demanded the right to use outside sources on climate change without considering their scientific merit, and still receive an A in the course. When the professor responded by requiring students to use data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to support their arguments, the student dropped the course. And then the student contacted a well-known alt-right student publication, which published an article about the course that not only included the syllabus, but the faculty member's phone number, email address, and office hours. They were unredacted. And as a result, the professor received threatening emails and became the subject of hateful commentary when the story went viral on Twitter. The student was not punished by the administration. And this is just one example of the stories that they heard. Now, most of the research about scholars' experiences of threats and harassment is based on small qualitative studies, which can tell us a lot about the experience of harassment and its fallout, but it can't really speak to prevalence. And it's difficult to gauge prevalence because there's many reasons that people might be reluctant to report. But the AAUP also shared some statistics about what they found in those 50 responses. So they found out that 48% included threats of violence, but 79% of the harassment that was experienced on social media included threats of violence. They found that 62% of the respondents were women, so it appears that women are being overrepresented. And then they asked people, what aspect of your work do you think led to this harassment? And 48% said they were harassed because of their work about race, and 14% said they were harassed about their work about gender. So clearly, this is important because there's a disproportionate number of diversity scholars experiencing these kinds of threats and harassment. But as you can see from the example with the climate change course, it's not limited to that field. Now, the AAUP did their survey in 2017, And we all know that a lot has changed in the US political climate and in the state of social media in the past 6 years, things that we might expect would increase the prevalence and the intensity of these kinds of experiences. So to name just a few, and of course, this is not a comprehensive list, we've seen the rise of the BLM movement to address police violence against African Americans, and we've seen a backlash in response. We've seen a spread of anti-LGBTQ legislation. We've seen teaching bans and book bans and attacks on DEI initiatives in higher education. And at the same time that all this was going on, we've seen a loosening of controls on hateful speech on social media platforms. And I want to note that in our own survey that we sent you, our audience, prior to today's session, we heard from individuals in our community who've experienced harassment and threats based on their scholarship and advocacy about Palestine. And at the same time, we also know people are facing increased anti-Semitism on many campuses, and that some faculty and staff have expressed reluctance to report those experiences because they feel they're being targeted based on their Jewish identity and not because of a specific position that they've expressed. What I wanted to say by sharing these statistics and these examples is to show how the prevalence of threats and harassment, especially online, but not limited to online, can create a chilling effect on dialogue and on academic freedom. And those are both essential to the university's mission of teaching and creating knowledge. The specter of these threats is especially acute for people who study and teach about diversity, justice, and the experiences of underrepresented groups, but it also includes natural scientists and physicians who work on topics like reproductive health and climate change. Now, at the same time, across the small literature that looks at this issue, we're also hearing frustration about institutional responses or the failures of institutions to respond to protect faculty who are experiencing threats and harassment. And many feel that the university's policies are not prepared or designed to address these experiences. A scholar named Goss and her colleagues have looked at workplace harassment policies across universities in Canada, and they found 3 problems that I think are relevant to our situation in the US as well. They found policies that try to protect members of the university community from harassment are usually aimed at protecting them from other members of the same institution. So they're often unprepared to address threats that come from the outside. They found that those policies often describe their scope only in relation to spaces at the university. So they're limited to responding to abuse that take place at university events or events related to work and study. And so they can't address harassment that's experienced at one's home or, leaving notes on people's cars. They also found that the reporting process is often cumbersome and kind of lags behind the speed and frequency with which this kind of tech-facilitated violence is occurring. So we're always playing catch-up. As Trishette talked about, these problems are particularly urgent and acute because scholars are increasingly expected to have an online presence, because they negatively affect scholars' research, teaching, and their personal and professional relationships and their well-being. And because scholars often say that they have few options but to deal with the consequences of these threats and harassment on their own. They feel often that they're receiving little support from their institutions. So today we want to think about what an institutional response to protect scholar safety from threats and harassment could look like. And we're fortunate to be joined by 4 insightful panelists. So as I introduce them, I invite them to turn off their cameras and to unmute. So we're joined today by Nina Flores. She's an associate professor of advanced studies in education and counseling at California State Long Beach. And she's also a senior fellow in the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. We have John Lofi, who is Executive Director of Marketing and Communications in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts here at the University of Michigan. We have Mani Marcello, who's Director of the Office of Threat Assessment at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And finally, we have Patrick Grzanka, who is Divisional Dean for Social Sciences and Professor of Psychology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So thank you for being here and welcome. Okay. So before we go right into this discussion with our panelists, we thought it would be a good time to engage you, our audience, with a poll. And we'll be sending that out momentarily. So the poll question is, have you experienced or do you know someone who has experienced harassment or threats as a result of their scholarship and teaching? The response options are yes, no, and unsure. So let's take a couple of moments to collect some responses. Okay, are we ready to share the results? Okay, well, maybe it shouldn't be surprising that people who are here today with us, 67% of them either have experienced harassment themselves or know someone who have. And then a smaller but about equal proportion of people say that they have not or that they're unsure. So I think that's a great set of context to kick us off with talking about what are the risks and threats to safety to scholars who are engaged in anti-racism and diversity scholarship, trying to understand the scope of the problem. And Patrick, I wonder if you could get us started by telling us about some of the experiences that you've had.
Hi, Liz. It's nice to see you all. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. This is the first time that I've discussed publicly my own experience with being attacked as a scholar. I have been doing public work throughout my entire career, both pre and post tenure. And I've been doing work that might be deemed controversial all that time, including graduate school and during my stint as a non-tenure track lecturer at Arizona State University. I was used to receiving intermittent harassment over email, phone, and snail mail to work, but it never deterred me from my projects and for speaking out in and to the press, because I'm committed to translational social science and to using scholarship to advance social justice. This is a core value of mine. That's why I accepted an invitation to participate in a documentary in summer 2021. I was contacted by a producer, Rebecca Teresi, who emailed with me back and forth and said that she was part of a group called the Gender Unity Project, which represented, or was funded by rather, a benevolent anonymous benefactor, creating a film about LGBT people and their lives to dispel myths and to lift up the voices of, in particular, trans people. In our correspondence, I asked as a cis man that they would confirm that trans people would be included and foregrounded in the film. And what they said to me was that they wanted a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies. I was the chair of the University of Tennessee's WGS program at the time, to simply define some key terms, which is something that I felt both comfortable with and was appropriate. We ultimately scheduled the interview for early November of 2021, and I agreed to a question list of straightforward questions about my work and about key terms in gender studies, and I signed an online consent form for recording. The moment the crew arrived, I became suspicious. They were pushy. None of them appeared visibly queer or trans, and they didn't tell me who would be interviewing me, but that it wasn't the producer with whom I had corresponded, which further raised my concerns. The moment the interviewer walked into the room, I knew something was wrong. He was not friendly or affable, and the questions began plainly enough, but they felt interrogative. He was visibly uncomfortable when I directly answered how I identify as a gay cisgender man, and then the questions quickly became transphobic and combative. I struggled at first because I realized that this was a setup, and that I was trying to both speak coherently and also decide what to do in the moment in an office where I work on campus where I had never been threatened before. I felt like if I stopped the interview and walked out, that I would be framed as unwilling to answer his straightforward questions, which were, of course, transphobic, including the question that had been popularized by several prominent figures, including my U.S. Senator, Marsha Blackburn, earlier that spring, what is a woman? So I stayed, and once I gained my footing, I argued with him. Once I'd made my points, I concluded the interview and told them to get out of the building. I emailed the producer, Rebecca Terese, and revoked my consent, but again, she didn't respond. I assumed that they were trans-exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs, but I didn't know the scope of the project until many months later. Using my social networks, my personal social networks, I spoke to a lawyer in Nashville who said that she could easily send a cease and desist and revocation of consent letter to them. But I also mentioned the incident to my department head in psychology, who immediately called to the Office of General Counsel, who she had on speed dial, as I think many department heads do. And the lawyers in the office were wonderful to me. They agreed to send a letter to the PO box of the LLC of the Gender Unity Project, which was allegedly based in Denver. They did so and demanded a response, but of course they didn't receive it. I sat in agony for months wondering what would happen to the footage until sitting in a doctor's office lobby in February of 2022, I saw a friend's Instagram repost a story about the Gender Unity Project. Eli Eric, a trans activist and doctoral student, had exposed the fraud after they were also targeted for an interview. They found the project out and posted their story on Twitter, and it went viral. I then realized the truth of what had happened to me, which is that I was interviewed by Matt Walsh, a right-wing sort of D-list celebrity who now works for the Nashville-based right-wing propaganda machine, the Daily Wire. I'm going to tell you probably more details about my story during the conversation today, but I'll say that after we found out that the Daily Wire was the producer of the documentary, General Counsel and the Provost's office and the Vice Chancellor for Communications all agreed that it was best to not provoke them before the release of the film, which we learned would happen later that spring. And the reason why is because there was still a hope, especially after the trailer for the film was released and I wasn't in it, that maybe I'd wind up on the cutting room floor. They also thought, and I think quite wisely, that had the university taken further action against the Daily Wire, that it would have made more of a story and I would have become more of a target. The film was ultimately released on June 1st, 2022, which was, of course, the first day of Pride Month. The harassment began immediately. Fortunately, I had preemptively locked down all of my social media, but the emails were relentless. Key administration figures, including the Vice Chancellor for Comms and the Chief of Staff, helped work with me to filter some of my emails, but I got used to a new normal of quotidian harassment, intimidation, and threats. Summer 22, was very painful as major world pop culture figures also discussed the film, and sometimes me explicitly, including Megyn Kelly, J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, and Matt Taibbi. There was also lots of support from left-wing and progressive activists and writers, but every time anything went viral about me that was positive, it also spurned another wave of harassment. I eventually received a serious death threat 9 months after the film was released. The FBI investigated, which was facilitated by the University of Tennessee Police's cybercrimes liaison, who was amazing here and helped me negotiate that process. The person who made the death threat emailed me from a Gmail account, which was foolish on their part because, of course, that's traceable via subpoena, and they were interviewed by the FBI. The film was re-released last summer, also on June 1st to Twitter. You may have seen or heard about it because it was free on Twitter for a time being, and the harassment surged again. I have never seen the film and will never watch it, including my parts. And I wanted to just make a note here. I know we have lots to talk about today, that one of the things that I've learned in the wake of the film and of being a friend and colleague to so many people who've experienced harassment is that when we indulge our voyeuristic interests to try to see what has happened to our friends and colleagues, we inadvertently promote their harassment by adding to hits and views and actually making money for organizations like the Daily Wire that generate ad revenue from clicks. So I ask that you not Google anything about Walsh or what is a woman. I can testify to my own pain and tell you the details of what I've experienced, but we don't want to give any more attention to them and the people who seek to harm scholars and members of marginalized groups. Thank you again, Liz, for inviting me here.
And Patrick, thank you for sharing that very painful story so that we can all use it to think with. I think this is a great time to ask Dr. Flores, how does this story, resonate or differ from some of the extensive interviews that you've done with other scholars who've experienced threats and harassment?
Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing that story. I really appreciated that you were also so vulnerable in talking about how this is the first time that you've shared this publicly, and it feels like a real honor to be in this space with you and talking about this, knowing that this is challenging and an ongoing issue and that the harassment continues to spike. I'll start at the end, which is to say that now you're a mentor and a support for other people who have gone through this. And to me, that really echoes one of the key findings from my research, which is that faculty need teams of support when this instance happens. And so to know also that the harassment may continue to peak over time, because we all know things go viral for different reasons, and then they cool down and they go viral again. But to have that team ready, because someone can be providing you with actual, let's say, sorting through your email support, right? Like, please, I just can't, but I am expecting these emails, help me. Someone can provide you help with social media. If you have not, like in your case, you were able to preemptively lock things down. For a lot of people, they wake up in the morning and they have thousands of tweets and they're like, whoa, what happened? I went to bed and everything was fine. And this morning, they need people at the institutional level, right, to be taking care of things that institutions are able to take care of. They need people at the department level to be taking care of things that are immediate to the department and to the staff. I think sometimes staff are left out of the conversations, but I know that office staff, for some of the people that I've interviewed, were really part of this harassment because their phones were inundated with phone calls. The general emails were also, just overwhelming to the offices. And then also their student workers got caught up in it as well because they're in the office and taking those calls. Part of that team support too is, as you were talking about, the comms people and making sure that people have a plan ahead of time. It sounds like you were actually perhaps able to work with people in the moment, which is fantastic. Some of the people I interviewed were not in the similar position, so some of the statements sound either defensive or have completely left the faculty member out, or don't even stand with the faculty member. And so to think about the ways in which your institution, at whatever level you feel it's possible, the department, the college, the actual campus itself, could have that preemptive language ready seems to be very helpful, because the statement that you come up with now will actually champion your values and what you want to say, whereas a statement you're coming up with in the middle of a crisis is either going to sound like a statement in the crisis or is going to be just not what you would champion now. So some of that has come out of my findings as well. One of the ways that, and I was thinking about this as we were preparing for this talk, because I just came from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where they invited me for a 2-day event on their campus, where I literally met with department heads. I met with different departments in general, other leadership, campus stakeholders, faculty organizations, just to have these conversations, just to get them started, just to do workshops on what is our plan and who's going to do what. And I think that that's one of the key findings of this, is how do we actually apply this and what does this look like in practice? And it looks like you just need to do it, right? And I know that sounds so easy, but it's not. And so I think part of this webinar that I really appreciate too is that we're getting conversations started. So anyone who's watching, who's thinking about, like, what's our first step? Well, this is the first step right here if you're not already doing something on your campus. And it's not too late to start preparing, right? Because then you're not caught in the only responding, only reacting. You already have something to work from.
Thank you. Since we're near the beginning of this session, I really wanted to help kind of illustrate and convey kind of all the multiple layers of fallout from an experience like this. And I wondered if either Patrick or Nina or someone else would like to talk a little bit about the impact. And I mean, I feel like we've touched on that, but I think it's worth spending some time on, because I think it's really important to be very close to what's at stake here needs to be very top of mind. So, Nina, are there things that you're hearing from your respondents about what were, what's the fallout? How did it affect their work? How did they respond? Or Patrick or anyone else?
I can speak just more generally about it, and then of course, I'm sure Patrick has things to add as well. So I think that there's so much different fallout that occurs at almost every possible point in your life. And so what I've heard from a lot of people is like, certainly there's work fallout. Now I feel a little hesitant, like even if I still feel like this is exactly what I want to do, I'm second guessing some of my approach. Some people have talked about a self-censorship that they're experiencing because they know that if I do this, am I prepared for what's going to happen, even though I've been working on this issue for 10, 20 years maybe. There's also a silencing effect that's happened for some of people's, like, how there's like a secondary silencing. If you see it happen to someone else, you're almost like, oh, I'm not even consciously thinking about it, but I don't want that to happen to me. But in the non-work sphere, some of the fallout of me, some of my participants have physically moved because they were doxxed and they're receiving death threats at their home, and they have children. And they're like, I can't, like, what on earth do you want me to do? Even if it was just me, I can't stay here. And so to think about the wide range of potential impacts and fallouts, for someone to be moving, and for some of these people, they left their institution even, and it wasn't just because their institution wasn't supportive, but they had to leave. They could not be affiliated there anymore. And to me, that's, so many people describe this as the worst thing that has ever happened to them because it's ongoing and it has no clear start and end point, and there aren't stages to move through. It is, you never know if it's going to peak again. And so I think that fallout is really multifaceted.
Nina, thank you so much for your work and your research on this, which is incredible to provide synthetic and broad context to the multiple layers and multiple registers of harm that are relevant to these kinds of attacks, as Liz put it. Speaking from my own experience, which was both like very grand in scale, but then also had somewhat that I was insulated from some of the professional consequences of it. I am a white man who has a lot of social and cultural capital on my campus. And so I was able to easily access administrators very quickly to kind of rally the troops, so to speak, and to get support. I'm very fortunate for that. I can imagine that untenured people or those who have social locations or positions that are far more vulnerable than mine might be terrified to even reach out for support at the risk of institutional harm. So sort of another layer of potential consequence to the public shaming, so to speak, that they might be otherwise experiencing. I will say that some of the psychologically relevant things and professionally relevant things for me is that when these things happen, there's a tremendous amount of self-blame and shame that you experience. I felt mortified and foolish and have replayed an infinite number of times all of the steps that brought me into that room for the interview. And then even the things that I said, wishing in the splicing that of course they did to make me look as foolish as possible, wishing that I hadn't said certain things or had said them different ways. And then in the aftermath, like the harassment is about reminding you of that. And the harassment is about making you feel small, unqualified, a moron. And in the harassment is all about humiliation. And I don't think that can be understated, because that means that your colleague who's trying to go to work every day is experiencing psychic turmoil that is almost unfathomable in scope, because so few people have the experience of celebrity/infamy that comes from these kinds of moments where you feel like all your anonymity is lost. I'm recognized from that film all the time. And so I would say that for the first year of the film's release, every time someone looked at me in public for more than a glance, I became paranoid that they were thinking about the film. And many people confront me about the film in public and in everyday life. I'll also say that a lot of my colleagues were incredibly supportive, both here and throughout the country and the world. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. But a lot of people on campus, and especially in my department, said nothing to me ever. And to this day, I've never brought it up. And I think that they do that because they're uncomfortable. But I will say that the second consequence, at least for me, and I do have to guess that it's a bit generalizable, is that when someone knows that this has happened to you and then you neglect to say anything to them, it can lead the person to believe one of two things. One is that the person that your colleagues don't think that it matters and that they don't think it's particularly serious what you're going through, or that it's not consequential or worth bringing up. Or even worse, they think you brought it on yourself and you deserve it because of the work that you do. And I know that's what I have felt at many times over the past 2 years, that people think that my work is too salacious and that I should be tamer in the kinds of things that I study, and that I should keep my mouth shut. And I shouldn't have spoken to the press to begin with, and then I brought it on myself. So that's just some of the things I think that feel really relevant to me. And Liz, who is a close personal friend, also knows that, you know, in the throes of the depression that came in the wake of it, like, it's very hard to work because every day of your life you just feel horrible. Again, I had tenure, so it didn't ruin my career, but the consequences can be profound for professional development.
Yeah. Thank you both. I mean, I together, I feel like you've painted a really vivid picture of what the stakes are and what it looks like. So this is a good moment, I think, to pivot. And I think Nina has also helped us lead into this conversation. What could a successful or effective institutional response look like? Or maybe it's more correct to say, what could successful responses look like? Because we've already established that it's coming from multiple directions and needs a multi-pronged response. And so this is a good time to launch our second poll question. And this time the question is, how confident do you feel about your university's capacity to support you if you were to experience threats or harassment? And so the response options are on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very confident and 1 being not confident at all. So let's take a few moments to hear your responses. Graham, when you think the voting has slowed down, would you share the results? Okay, it's looking more or less like a bell curve here to me, with just a few in the categories of not confident or very confident, and other people are arrayed in the middle. So that's interesting that people are having different experiences. And, you know, maybe not surprising, because it does seem that different campuses are kind of in different stages of development of these policies. And so this is a really good time to pivot to start with Mani. What do you think a successful or an effective institutional response would include? And maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what you do and your role in this, and maybe some examples you have from the different places you've worked.
Sure. So again, I'm Mani Marcello, she, her, hers. And I just want to say, Patrick, how appreciative I am, first, of your willingness to be vulnerable. I hope you know I've listened to your story and I'm going to remember it. So when it comes to my work, I work in threat assessment, and this is an area I'm incredibly passionate about. From the genesis of that, like the work of DEI, when you think of restorative practices, as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, can't have like an effective threat assessment program without remembering those elements as well. They're so coupled and overlap. So I just want to put that into the universe, because oftentimes when folks hear threat assessment, what comes to mind is active shooter or fear, right? Like, our goal with a threat assessment program is to intervene, to de-escalate before something reaches a critical incident. And so the work that I do, you know, I've been doing this for a while. I was very fortunate to work at the University of Iowa before transitioning to the University of Illinois last year. At Iowa, they have a full-time dedicated team that comprises both the university campus as well as the hospital. So it was a really neat experience being able to work with threat assessors that this is what they did all day, every day. here at the University of Illinois, I've been charged to create that program. So right now I'm the single full-time dedicated professional doing the work, but I work with a multidisciplinary team that expands campus. So incredibly brilliant folks that I work with that are really in tune with our campus community and culture. And so when I think of the institutional response and what that could look like, one, you need to know your campus, right? Are you serving just undergraduate students? Is it graduate students? What does your faculty community look like and your staff? Here at the University of Illinois, our program, we support students, staff, faculty, and visitors that touch upon our campus. And that also comprises an airport, daycares, as well as a K through 12 system. So just putting into the universe, that's a lot to think about when we think of having a program. And we want to do prevention work, but we can't do that in isolation, right? It needs to be a culture shift. So one of the things I was really excited about in being able to talk about threat assessment on this platform is being able to really advocate for the need of a community response, right? We are all in this together, and it's not a singular unit that is shifting the narrative and thinking about compassion in our response and how we holistically do that. And again, when I think of being holistic in a response, you need to remember the why, as well as all of the other aspects of a person's identity that could be compounded in our response. When you think of like hierarchy of need, because we were talking about the classroom, right? I was not surprised when I saw 67 respondents communicated that they knew somebody, right, that has gone through a doxing scenario or a situation that's impacted somebody in the classroom. We've also seen this impact our undergraduate students, and it's amazing how many even staff talk about being fearful of going into the office because of something they've seen or they're hearing in the news, or just concerned for safety. And so while I can't ensure safety, and I wish I could, right? I wish I could look into a glass orb and know that my wife and our little child will always be safe. That isn't something I can guarantee. And yet the work that I do, we get to invest in prevention measures that will work to de-escalate, to identify folks that could be on a pathway to harming themselves or others, as well as to think outside the box and employ resources or different avenues to de-escalate. Because our goal is to have that compassion, right? And to really think about how can we be restorative, right? Is there a way that we can repair the harm? Is there a way that we can de-escalate? And whether or not that means transitioning somebody away from campus or continuing to have somebody in our community, but doing it in a way that we are offering resources for their success. And it's complicated. Humans, we are notorious for being incredibly complicated and messy. And yet this work is so critical, and it's something that absolutely has my heart. So I'm excited to be here. And if there's other questions that I'm able to respond to, I will.
Do other panelists have thoughts about what the components of an effective institutional response might include? John, I wonder if in some of your work, you've identified kind of some best practices.
Sure. Well, I'll also say thanks for inviting me to this, and to the other panelists, and for your expertise and passion and compassion in this space. One of the things, I don't know if this is a common experience, but as I started working on this and making connections with people like Mani, and was able to talk to people who are working on this problem, that feeling, Patrick, that you talked about of being alone, even when I haven't been targeted, I feel alone in this space, and sort of desperate often to feel like who's going to recognize what's happening here. And that feeling of loneliness is really a profound one. And it's really great to be connected to other people. And I would say to anybody who's out there feeling that way, there is a community and a network. I don't mean that to be a distraction, but that kind of goes to what I did. So I'm not a faculty member. I'm a communications person. And I came into this work because my team and I were getting called in to help faculty members who were being threatened, harassed, intimidated to respond. And many of my peers across the university at other schools and colleges were having the same experience. And we started talking about the need to do this in a less ad hoc way, right? To have a systematic approach of the kind that Nina and Mani have talked about, where we actually have systems that are ready to go to respond to these situations and prevent them. And so we were charged to form a committee to come up with some recommendations. And it was primarily around communications that we started. And we very quickly realized that this goes way beyond communications. This touches every aspect of the institution. And so any response that we have has to pull people from those different areas. So I would talk to the IT people because someone was having their email hacked or their website attacked. I would talk to the facilities people because someone needed to move offices because they had been doxxed, or their classroom because it had been threatened. We were talking to the research office because this is a major threat, as we've talked about before, to people's research productivity. And so the more that we talked about this, this issue, and the more we thought about how are we going to communicate about this, the more it became clear that communications is just one tiny part of it. And we have to have a comprehensive institutional approach to this. So our first recommendation was that we need sort of executive level sponsorship and ownership of these of a response, and to systematize that response, to be proactive, and to set up some sort of standing structure that can be quick to respond. So that's exactly the sort of thing that Mani is setting up, and I've seen it at other institutions, and that seems to be a really effective model. I'm sure there are many, many ways to set that particular framework up, but that's one place that I would suggest, like, is just fundamental. Like, you have to see this as an institution-wide challenge. And I guess one other thing, I think there's a key attitude that needs to go into this as well. The stories that we hear are infuriating and heartbreaking, and really challenging. The experiences that our friends and colleagues are going through are just abominable over and over again. And that's motivation enough for most of us to do this. But some of us have mentioned it already. This goes right to the heart of the academic mission. This goes absolutely to the core of who we are, what we're trying to do to express academic freedom, to research into all the corners of human knowledge and experience, and to understand it and to make it more complex. And if we can't respond to this kind of threat as an institution, then we're absolutely failing, not just failing our people who we hired to do this work. We're failing ourselves. We're failing our own values and our own purpose. So I think that attitude, I guess, is what I think is key also to adopt.
Mani, I think you're muted. You need a moment? Yeah. Do other panelists have thoughts about this? Nina, you really laid out a list for us in your comments earlier, but I'm wondering if this conversation, I saw you smiling, so maybe you have some other thoughts about it.
I was thinking about this, that both John and Patrick have mentioned the alone feeling at different points, and I think that this was something that so many of my participants shared as well, is the feeling that you may have friend support and colleague support, but you're still the one taking this home at night, right? And that you're still the one living with this day to day. And even after the check-ins stop, right? Even the best friends that are checking in a month after, or when they think something's going on, in those in-between moments, it's still with you, and you're still the one that comes across a random message. And for some of the people I interviewed, this went far deeper. These people who didn't have colleagues who were supportive, or maybe they had one or two friends. Like, we all have like best friends, right, in the department. But these are people who felt abandoned by their university. who felt in some cases, and Patrick, I was glad you mentioned this too, who were lecturers. So they felt like they couldn't take the leap to tell anyone because what if they weren't hired? What if they were now red flagged as that person who complains? What if this is actually something that all my colleagues are putting up with and I just can't do it and I didn't know? And so even those kinds of power dynamics and thinking about how that aloneness plays out. But the aloneness is so real. And so that team effort, I think, is still, again, at the top of my mind. But one of the things that came out of the campus visit I did with University of Nebraska was we need to center the harassed people. And so finding out what they want, right? There's no one size fits all approach, but there is like this kind of choose your own adventure plan that we could all have ready at our own campuses. And whether that's like at a department level, because maybe your department's really close and they have each other's backs. Maybe it's at the college level. Maybe you have a smaller college that's able to kind of control more of what's happening in terms of these policies. Maybe it is the university level, but again, understanding that the university is going to provide very different support than your colleagues, right? And thinking about what our expectations are for those different levels. But when we center the harassed person, something different happens because you actually ask them what they need and what they want, but you can continue checking in with them because part of that aloneness comes from the fact that in some of the people's cases that I've been talking with, no one reached out to them. They told their department chair, felt like they had excellent communication there. They were thankful for their support. And then that was the end. And so some of what Patrick was saying in terms of like, oh, sometimes colleagues won't say anything. But also no one else from their university ever reached out. It was like they had one comment and one conversation and like, well, that issue's taken care of. And so there was a question in the Q&A and I had some of the, I'd responded to one of them, that there's often this mismatch between how the person is experiencing this harassment, this targeted incident, which is overwhelming in every sense of the word. This is a crisis for them. This is a crisis that's not only personal, it's professional, and it's academic, and it's on campus, but it's not reaching necessarily a crisis level with the university. And so the responses are then mismatched because of that gap. So if we center the harassed person, we may also know, like, do they want you to issue a statement? Sometimes people don't, right? And I think we had talked about this in the prep meeting before. There are cases where people are like, please leave it alone. It's just going to make it worse. And there have been cases where it has. All of a sudden, an official statement comes out and it even maybe feels like it's borderline supportive. And now the harassment's back again because things had faded and tapered off. And so I think once we center the harassed person, we have some different options there and we can think about what is it that they need at these different levels? What are these different levels of the institution able to provide? And then how can we also push them further to do better?
Mani, how are we doing with the tech?
I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not sure what happened. How embarrassing. So there was a great question in the chat asking, what are the key members of a cross-functional threat assessment and response team? And from which spaces and what roles do they play at the university? I just think this is a wonderful question. I'm so glad it was asked. So again, it goes back to your type of institution. I think it's really important to know who is on your campus. But when you think of a threat assessment team on a university campus, it's so important to have representatives from your human resource team, as well as folks from the Division of Student Life. University police department is also really important because they have access to different types of information as well as counseling, right? You need to have somebody with a background in social work and mental health. These are really important components when we think about really understanding the different complexities of a university and coming together. There isn't ever a one size fits all in how we approach problems, and it's important to have a team that it can be complex in its makeup and also won't get into a space of groupthink, right? Because as soon as you have groupthink, that's when you really run into challenges because you're unable to think outside the box. So our team here at the University of Illinois, and something that I think is so special, is we're in a new division. So the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Administration and Operations, it started back in 2019. And so we're a new division and I'm a new department, right? So we're inaugural on all these different fronts. And I think it's a great place for an Office of Threat Assessment to be, because we are not in the Dean of Students and we're not located in HR and we're not located in a police unit, because all of those areas can also feel very punitive. We want folks to report and they need to know that we're in a space where we're not decision makers. With threat assessments, it's important too to really share that narrative. We're gathering information and we want to collect information to connect the dots. And if folks see threat assessment as a punitive space where a negative outcome could be a consequence, they're going to be really hesitant to share really what's happening. And whether that's contemplating violence to yourself or to other people, we want to get at the root of what's happening. Our team, we have folks that are from the Office of the Dean of Students, Human Resources. We have several folks from our police department, including social workers, that go out in tandem with officers for calls. We have a representative from housing, as well as faculty, staff, assistants, and wellbeing services. And then we also have an advisory group. And these are folks on our campus that are passionate about the success of our program. They're not doing the day-to-day or the weekly management and assessment of reports, but they are invested in what happens and in our success. So we have folks that are represented from our legal counsel, our provost office, again, making sure that faculty voice is really important and essential, as well as Title IX and employee equity. So that's here, Illinois. If you don't have a program at your institution, I'd really encourage you to connect with ATAP. It's the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and it's a really great way too to learn more about what could that look like on our campus to support what's happening in the classroom and working towards thinking about safety in a different way on our campus community. Because again, it's not the Office of Threat Assessment doing all the work. It needs to be a community effort and a community of care in how we think about ensuring that our faculty, staff, students, and visitors, when they visit our campuses, are able to do that in a way that they can bring their best selves and to be able to engage in thinking about how we shift that conversation and narrative forward. And you can't do that if you're fearful.
These are all fantastic points. I just thought I would add maybe two things. One is that, as I'm sure some of you saw, just a few weeks ago, at Arizona State, a non-tenure track lecturer was physically assaulted outside of their classroom, based only on the topic of their work in LGBT and specifically trans studies. This is the second time that Turning Point USA, a right-wing group, has done this to faculty in the state of Arizona, where the organization is based. They attacked similarly a person at the University of Arizona last year. The response from the university was full-throated. Michael Crow, the president, released, I think, a really well-done letter criticizing, condemning the attack on the faculty member, and unequivocally stating the institution's support for the faculty member and the work that they do. So it wasn't this kind of milquetoast statement of like, all faculty have free speech rights. Michael Crow specifically identified that LGBT studies and the work that this faculty member does are incredibly important to the educational mission of the institution, and that they're a valued faculty member. I think that's a critical distinction between just chalking all of this up to academic freedom or free speech, as opposed to noting that, one, we value the work that the person does and they're being attacked by virtue of the work that they do. I think that also gets to John. All of your comments have been really inspiring, but John, I don't know that I've ever heard someone so kind of plainly state that this issue is central. It's a key threat to the academic mission of our institutions. And I've been thinking a lot, now that I'm a dean, about what I can do to support my faculty who experience these kinds of threats. And I don't believe, as all the panelists have said, that a one-size-fits-all policy is kind of the way to go. But if we want to hire in trans studies, in Black queer studies, in critical disability studies, and we think that these are valuable areas, which many universities in very conservative environments do, we have to be prepared to support people, or else that just is superficial inclusion and academic capitalism. And so if we say that this is central to our academic mission, then that means that we need to be prepared to pause tenure clocks when appropriate, when people experience the psychic turmoil that comes from the fallout of an attack. We need to be prepared to reduce lecturers' teaching loads when they're experiencing harassment, because we need to understand that this isn't necessarily about like public facing work, but that oftentimes scholars come under attack, and perhaps most of the time they come under attack simply for doing their jobs and doing them quite well. this is sort of in response to my colleague and friend Rastumi's question in the Q&A, but I think that if we talked about this in the way that John has and my other panelists have as central to the academic mission of the university, and normalized things like tenure clock pauses and teaching releases and things that institutions should feel obligated to do to scholars under attack, maybe they'd take the attacks more seriously, and maybe they do more to preempt the attacks, like being unapologetic and supportive of even controversial topics that are taught on university campuses.
Well, Patrick, thanks for drawing my attention to this question from Russell Toomey, who asks, what advice or strategies do you suggest for faculty who are at institutions who've been less than responsive to these experiences? How can we help our universities understand the personal and professional gravity of these experiences and respond appropriately? I want to start with that question and kind of take it a step back and then return to Russell's question. So, John, you've chaired this task force or co-chaired it because the University of Michigan is currently trying to understand this and how they can do better. And I wonder if in your work you've identified, not only things that we could be doing, but maybe also what are the obstacles to doing those things? Like, what have you identified points of resistance or kind of difficulties in getting the systemic response set up? And then we can talk about individual faculty trying to lobby for themselves.
Well, I mean, so far my experience has largely been that there's recognition that this is something that we need to do, and encouragement for us to go and start to research it and try and find some solutions. I think that I think the obstacle is sort of inertia. It's not that there's in my experience, there's not been anybody putting up roadblocks, but we have, we're siloed. We have the ways that we've done things all along. To think about doing this effectively takes really careful thought. I mean, Mani and I had a chance to talk, and like the complexity of what she's setting up is really profound, and each university is going to do it differently based on its own internal structures and culture and so on. So I think that's the biggest hurdle is, how do you get to that point? I think that another thing is a lack of awareness of just how serious this is and what's actually going on the ground for faculty. And so there's a balance. One of the things that I heard all the time from faculty who were telling me stories like Patrick's is, this is so painful and it's re-traumatizing to tell the story. I'm so grateful to Patrick for sharing his, because I know this is just bringing this back up on a Thursday that you're not getting harassed like that. That's not so awesome. And so there's a balance to be struck between helping people understand exactly what is happening to our friends and colleagues to the fullest extent we can, and also not turning that into sort of something salacious or trauma porn or something like that, where we're sort of introducing them out to make some point. I'm not sure I'm answering your question very well, but those are my thoughts.
Mani, I wondered if you might also have some thoughts about it, since you've been at places that have been able to set up a systemic response. Do you have insight into that process, and were there obstacles along the way? And maybe that predates your time in these positions.
No, I appreciate the question. So I think what's so critical, and I was looking at the other questions that were coming in the chat, and it's so critical when you think about whether it's policy or setting up a team. There is a lot of complexities that you're trying to navigate. We already know that students, for example, have a lot more access to resources than faculty and staff do. We're already talking about just the lack of resources that we have on hand that we can offer. And what keeps coming back to me, and John, as you're processing and some of the questions that were in the chat, I kept thinking it also needs to be a top-down support, right? Like, we can be trying from the bottom of the pyramid to be pushing up. But if you don't have leadership that sees this as a critical issue, if you don't have leadership that's willing to invest in resources and personnel and staff-said resources, then it's going to be efforts that aren't fulfilling, right? It's going to fall flat. I see that there is a question about policy, for example, and what you hope universities will consider in policy development and supporting safety university members. I think it's so important if you can have leadership, for example, that's investing in a threat assessment team. It needs to be a team, not just one person. There needs to be an investment of resources as well as like ways that we can think outside the box and to have support of that too. There have been many times we've navigated different reports, and these are at the various places I've worked. And, it comes back to, well, this is how we've always done it. This is how our process is. This is how it's always been. But how do we interrupt that? Because we already know that a lot of our policies were created during a time when a lot of voices didn't have seats at the table to be part of that narrative in their construction. And so if we're also utilizing those policies and trying to navigate safety or faculty not feeling safe in the classroom, to me, it just feels like we're never going to get there because we don't have the investment and support that we need. So it's more than a policy. It really needs to be driven by senior leadership and investing and saying, hey, we need to look at this critically, and we need to do it in a way that we can have that prevention piece. And again, threat assessment, we are a prevention effort, not a response after something happens. So how do we invest in resources that offer that? And that's not just threat assessment, it's mental health. It's thinking about like safety and security physically in the classroom. There's lots of ways that we can, as institutions, think about safety, and how do we employ that, right? Like we can be creative.
Thanks.
I want to hop in really quick because I think that one thing that we haven't touched on really is that there's immense distrust between many faculty members and their institutions, right? Like, and that's nationwide. I don't think that's a secret. So when we think about these programs as starting top up, I think we simultaneously need to think about like, how does this also happen from the faculty out? Because a lot of faculty simply aren't going to go to the institutional level. And even if there is a path from a top-down support system, it may still not actually register and support the faculty and what they need. And sorry, I've been like drawing this whole time because I feel like I'm still a very analog person, but I have this like, oh, you can't see it because I've blurred out my background. It's like an octopus, but like the center is actually the faculty member and the person who's been harassed. And so they need access to all of these different tentacles, right? Like all of these pieces, they need access to an institutional support that's based on like IT. What is my IT support going to look like? What's my threat assessment support going to look like? What's my actual trauma support going to look like? What is the support at my department level going to look like? What is this? And so all of these pieces are moving at the same time. And I think that that's a key too. A policy can't be like one triggers the other, triggers the other. They are all moving. Sorry, my like arms. They're all moving simultaneously. And they are moving with the faculty member in mind. And I think that that's a different perspective because many institutions don't have a strong track record of putting the faculty center. And so in my own research, like I'm only interviewing the faculty member and like occasionally the staff members that have been affected by it. And these are the things that they're asking for, right? And these kinds of supports are coming from their direct experience. And so if we think about this kind of reverse of, we don't have to think about it as an octopus, but I'm just putting it out there because we do have then all of these kind of moving parts that are moving at their own paces. Right? They aren't necessarily all happening at this kind of measured pace. Some of them are going to be immediate and upfront, and then others are kind of like waving constantly in the background.
Well, that might be a good transition into, do you have ideas or advice about what faculty and scholars who are at institutions where there is a less full-throated response, what they can do to manage the octopus? And that could be things that you've seen work. I see a question in the chat about, are there nonprofits or external organizations that can help people if they're not getting support from their institutions? Any insight into that?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of institutions where it's just not going to be an option for the faculty member to go up their ranks, right? And in those circumstances, it may be that your department is very close knit. It may be that there's one person I talked to who an Institute of Ethnic Studies was particularly close knit, and so that's who they relied on. For other people, it's people who they went to grad school with. They have their network across the country that, like, these are my people, and I just happen to be in this department, and I know that my people are with me. And so figuring out your plan ahead of time for what your immediate support will be, so that then those people can help you also reach out to their own, like, professional or academic orgs or different people locally that are around that can support you as well. But I think that team, I can't say that enough. Like, it's never, otherwise it's a full-time job navigating this. So you're not only doing your job, but then you're also doing the job of navigating institutional policy, the job of navigating the onslaught of harassment, the job of also, like, thinking about your family and everything else. Those are 4 full-time jobs. And so to think about, like, how that team can help you. And I think it's perfectly fine if your team is not based at your university. And so if your team is your friends and your colleagues across the country, excellent. If your team is an organization or a church or someone that, like, you're already affiliated with in your community, that's fine. But just make sure that you have this team, that they're in the loop.
Their thoughts about advice for people who are in a position where they might have to put together their own team?
I think that one of the most beneficial things that I experienced in the context in which I had some amount of institutional support to navigate my experience was connecting with people around the world who'd gone through similar things. The experience of being so isolated is terrifying. And the people who I was connected to by way of friends and other scholars who had gone through similar experiences, it was incredibly validating and did something to mitigate some of the feelings of isolation. So now what I do is try to reach out to people who are being attacked. And I tell my story to people privately, and I try to be an interlocutor. And Eris Clemens, a colleague of mine, had noted in the comments that, like, it puts so much on people who've been through the experience to tell their stories publicly, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. But I don't find it as challenging to talk privately, and I feel actually incredibly compelled to do so when I know people are going through it elsewhere. These are these kinds of, like, informal interpersonal connections are really important, and it's why I really want to compel everyone on the webinar today to think about the small steps that they can take in their own life, not just institutional responses, but to be vocal supporters to their colleagues, both at their institutions and beyond, who are doing the work and facing horrible consequences for doing the work.
I'm getting a note that we're having lots of questions coming in, so give me a moment just to look. Let's see. I see a question here that I kind of feel goes to what Nina was observing about distrust between faculty and administrations, and it's about the role of kind of external influences on what make universities decide to provide strong support behind their faculty or not. So things they're hearing from donors, things they're hearing from board members, political pressures. I'm not sure how we can address that in terms of what's actually to be done. But I wonder again, Nina, if that's something that you're hearing from the people you interview and how they're dealing with that, feeling that certain issues are less likely to get support from the administration because of the larger context of politics, donors, parents, etc.
I've definitely heard from some people who just flat out say they don't expect their institution to support them, and it's mostly, like, already just a wall up for them. They're like, oh, I don't think they will because of a donor issue, which, and I mean, reading in the comments too, like, oh my gosh, what would it take to have a donor campaign based off of John's comments that this is an actual like academic issue? This is the heart of what we purport, like we purport that our colleges and universities are doing. How do we get those donors? Like, where are those donors? And can we please fund us? Because yeah, I understand it, and I get it, and I wonder if there's a window in there too, between the actually just dismissing, like, oh, I know that my university won't support me, and like, well, what can your university do? And I wish that we were not reliant on donor funds, and I don't want to sidestep that at all. But what is the in between there? Because I think there has to be some kind of in between there.
Patrick, I wonder also if you might have some thoughts about this based on both your own experience and then the story you told about ASU, since both those examples are located in states where it would appear that the prevailing political climate might make universities less likely to respond to these kinds of threats against individual faculty member pursuing topics that within the broader political context of the state might be considered unpopular.
I was typing a response to Lori Stoff about Turning Point being Turning Point USA, being potentially like banned from campus, and I sort of roll my eyes at a little bit of the lack of like law enforcement response to two professors being attacked by the same group in 12 months, physically accosted in public on a university system in a purple but reddish state. And not doing anything about it. I think that I'm also kind of ruminating on, I don't have the data, but Lakeisha Harrison raises this question of inequitable institutional responses. She wrote, for example, institutions rallying around white males who are targeted by gaslighting or isolating Black LGBTQ women who are targeted, as just an example. And I think like my inclination is to say, as a scholar of intersectionality, like I bet the institutional responses are unequal. That would be my guess. And in really hostile environments, I think one of my fears is that without policy, like at the risk of sounding like a dean, I worry that without some policy, we find ourselves in a position where there are some kinds of attacks on some kind of people that will warrant an institutional response, and other kinds of attacks on other kinds of people will be met with silence or worse. And so I think that structures have to be put in place. And I just want to say that I think Moni is like making the blueprint at Illinois that we might be able to, Amani, excuse me, that we could use to, adjust contextually in other spaces and places. So those are just some of my thoughts. Liz, did that get at what you were thinking? Okay.
Yeah. And I just want to amplify that as someone who's also been a dean, that, and I think it's also a really foundational part of the principle of DEI is that having procedures that are transparent and, visible is not just sort of, good practice, but it ensures equity. And I feel like so much of what we've talked about today have been people having to sort of scramble to create responses. And because institutions weren't prepared with some kind of systemic response. And I think that's just such an important insight that the reason to do this is not only to have a better response, but also to equitably have that better response. I feel like that's one of the key insights to come out of this conversation today. So thank you.
We want to make sure that the same kinds of attacks don't have like deeply asymmetrical consequences depending on who winds up attacked. I also just want to note that while I agree 100% about the notion of putting the faculty member at the center and the institutional response should be organized around the faculty member's needs, I will admit that like I didn't know what was possible or what I wanted at the time. I had no idea. Like when it was actually friends of mine who said like, but what about your email? And I was like, I don't know what about my email. Like what do you mean my emails? And then it was in collaboration with very high level staff at the university that we came up with this plan of monitoring my emails. And they did it for 3 weeks. I mean, I had no privacy, to be fair. So I had to be willing to give that up. But nonetheless, the monitoring of my emails enabled me to like function in my day-to-day life for the first wave of harassment. And I don't think we can expect faculty members to say like, what I really need is the chief of staff, the chancellor's lawyer, and the vice chancellor for comms to read my emails all day. That's just not something that I think most faculty members would presume is even possible. Also, like something that we didn't have at UT, but I think probably would have benefited me tremendously, is a mental health care professional on staff with expertise in this kind of area that I could have gone to. I did not have the wherewithal. I wasn't in therapy at the time, like to go searching for a therapist in the midst of my own personal crisis. And I think it would have been great if I could have had someone sort of right there on Zoom or, in person to work with me during those months. I also think training for staff and faculty who are dealing with someone attacked needs to involve an interpersonal component. When people are being attacked, they may be literally experiencing panic. And so the victim isn't necessarily going to exhibit the best kind of behavior or the most professional behavior, or have what, in at least in the context of like 21st century predominantly white institutions, constitutes the behavior that we expect from faculty. And so I think helping people be trained to deal with that and manage that, to give people the grace to feel their way through these incidences. I was so fortunate to be able to have people who I knew I could sort of panic at and with, who wouldn't judge me, and enabled me to work through my own experience. And I don't think that's not in a policy document. That's in leadership, as my 3 other panelists have underscored, that leadership needs to instill a culture and provide specific training and resources on how to respond to people who are in crisis like that.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. So that is part of this centering of the faculty, is making sure you have this plan ahead of time, right? And making sure you have this team, because absolutely, like, that's one more job, right? Figuring out what you need, figuring out like what your support is. And so one of the workshops that I had led at UNL, we were actually thinking about this as like love languages almost. Like, what are the things that I know I need for support? Like, I'm a person who needs quality time. Okay, can someone like just come by for 30 minutes and sit with me? I may need to vent at them. I may need to do other things, but like, what is that thing? For other people, it's like, oh, well, I need gifts. Okay, well, can someone come by with coffee? I will feel supported by just my colleagues showing up with coffee, sit with me for a moment. And so when we even think about like, what are the things that we would know we would need ahead of time, it does not mean at all that those will be the things we need in that crisis, but it does give us a starting point so that we can navigate from there. Because without any starting point, like, I don't know what I need, and you're throwing options at me, and now I'm doubly overwhelmed, not only by the harassment, but by also like what my possibilities might be.
Something I want to add in there too. I'm sorry, John, I'll be quick. But something you said, Patrick, was this panic. And something else that's just been coming up from this dialogue is this idea of somebody working in isolation, being in isolation, feeling isolated. And that we also know is a contributing factor when you think of violence, maybe towards self or even other people. And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of listening to your body and what you're experiencing and trusting yourself. Society is really good at telling us we're overreacting. As a queer woman, I can't tell you how often I'm told that what I'm feeling, maybe I'm overreacting or I'm being too sensitive. There's some really good literature out there. There's Sharp Women as well as The Gift of Fear. Both of these are really great readings when you think about listening to that intrinsic voice saying something's not right, something's off here. I'm getting these messages from this person I don't know, but it's happened like X number of times, and they're starting to escalate. It's okay to share that and listen to what your body is telling you, because our anatomy, how we're created, it's amazing how we're picking up on things before our brain is even able to make sense of it. So I can't emphasize it enough, because this truth that folks are experiencing this in isolation, I'm thinking about that, right? And how can we continue to push back on that to show that we are a culture of care and that you matter and that we're seeing you and that we're responding. So I just wanted to add that. John, I didn't mean to talk over.
That was way smarter than what I was going to say. I just wanted to add on to what Nina was saying, and that the planned responses that you have, like what are even the right questions to be asking before you even get to what might be an answer. That's what I think a good comprehensive university-wide, institution-wide response can do. There can be all kinds of really great help that we can and in fact are providing in these sort of one-off situations or unit by unit. But often we're not prepared for the bigger questions. We're not as effective as we can be. And so that's where I think this can go. And back to the idea of like, where do you start with this? And maybe this kind of goes to some of the questions in the Q&A is, I would say, start looking for existing structures where you can have these conversations. Mm-hmm. So I know, for instance, here at U of M, the AAUP chapter is talking about this. The mm-hmm. Faculty Senate is talking about this. Mm-hmm. Different faculty organizations are talking about it. My colleagues and I are talking about it. It's happening in the IT office, right? And so are there forums or structures or groups that already exist that you could just slide this onto an agenda and start the conversation there? It probably isn't sufficient, but it's a good place to start making these connections and getting people thinking about this. And also, they can sometimes be the kind of safe environment where you can be really clear about the actual costs in ways that, again, don't traduce the stories and turn it into trauma porn.
Well, this has been so insightful, and I really appreciate all the ways that you've contributed with your, special avenues of insight into this topic. I'm going to say a few things just about what stood out to me about this, and I hope that this webinar could be the beginning of a longer conversation. First of all, what I really heard over and over again as a theme is this issue of the loneliness and the invisibility of that people feel who are going through this. And it's interesting to me because it's both about the nature of the harm, and it's an obstacle, I think, to us really understanding the scope of this problem, because it makes it really hard for us to assess the prevalence. But we have heard today, what we do hear in this qualitative research is about the breadth of the harm, about how many different aspects of their work, their family, their personal sense of safety. I was really struck, Nina, when you talked about people abandoning programs of research that they had invested in for decades. So we saw the human harm, and at the same time we heard about how the maybe magnitude of that harm is even greater for some people than others, right? Some people have greater access to the kind of social capital that Patrick talked about that could be a buffer on this in some ways. And yet, even for people who have those protections, it can be devastating. We heard John talk about this as having a very dangerous impact on the mission of the university. So this is much bigger than the individual scholars. It's about our ability to keep doing teaching and research on, especially on people who are underrepresented, but also, certain aspects in the natural sciences. And so then in response to this, we talked a lot about the necessity and desirability of a multi-pronged response, but we also talked about how sort of the silos and the status quo can make that hard. And when John was talking, I was thinking, how often do you have to ask, IT to come together with housing, unless it's, to put in the wireless, but in a crisis response way, that's probably very unusual. So we're already siloed, and we're asking organizations to work together who might not have before. Two more points. One is the importance of having a coherent and transparent policy in order to make sure that people who are experiencing this get relief in an equitable way. And then finally, it was a great way to go out. John's comments that I'm going to summarize as just, we need to organize, right? There are places on your campus that people are already thinking about this, at the very least, your local chapter of the AAUP, but take this to your faculty senate, take it to the offices that are probably already working on this, and think about how to bring these multiple voices together for on behalf of a topic that, at least in this room, 67% of us have touched, either ourselves or through people we know and care about, and try to draw attention to this, and that there are that can be the first step to getting people to work together on this complicated problem. So thank you again to our panelists. I also want to thank our NCID staff who do such a beautiful job organizing these events. And I want to thank all of you for spending this time with us today. And as I mentioned at the start, I hope you will keep an eye out for our other webinars in this series, Doing DEI Now. And you can also see future ones that you might not be able to make, or ones that you've missed. They'll be available shortly on our website. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day.